So as we begin, you already heard, the lesson for this morning is a thorn in Jesus' side. When I think about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, I also think about another story. A man is in desperate need of a job. And he hears that the local zoo is hiring. He goes with great anticipation, expecting who knows what kind of job he's going to get, but he's going to get to work hopefully with animals. And he's excited by that. But when he gets there, he finds out the job's not quite everything he thought it was going to be. What they want him to do is to put on a monkey suit and play the part of a gorilla. Because there's a big day coming. Field trip day. All these kids are going to be there, and they don't have a gorilla. And man, these kids are expecting a gorilla. So, with much hesitation, though, he still agrees. He needs the money. It seems like it'll be fun, so he agrees to do this. So, the day comes. He gets to the zoo. He puts on that gorilla suit, goes in the enclosure, and he spends his time, monkeying around, walking around like gorillas do, swinging from trees, eating the peanuts and bananas that they're throwing at him. But as the day progresses, he becomes really engorged on bananas, and his mind's not quite thinking right. And as he is swinging about, he launches himself a little too far and lands into the cage next to him, which is the lion cage. Once he gets in and realizes what's happening, he begins to shout, "Help! Help! Someone get me out!" And as the lion gets closer to him, he gets up in his face and leans down, and he hears a voice that says, "Shush, or you'll get us both fired." Moral of the story is, just because what stands before you might look like a gorilla or a lion, or swing and howl like a lion or a gorilla, that does not necessarily mean that what you are looking at is one. And that's the idea that we're going to apply for the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and for us today as modern Christians. That this attitude of what we see is not quite what we get, it does nothing but put a thorn in Jesus' side. It does nothing but put a thorn into us sharing the gospel truth. Matthew chapter 23, starting in verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them, so much as with a finger. But they do all of their deeds to be noticed by men. For they broaden their tassels and lengthen their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplace and being called rabbi by men." I think we might be pretty familiar with the stories and the ideas of who the Pharisees are during the time of Jesus. But growing up, I never really felt like I understood the history behind them. And that's because you got to do a little extra digging. Because when you go from the minor prophets at Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, you don't see these Pharisees and Sadducees and zealots. And you might hear things about the Maccabees. You don't hear anything about this. When you go in, you only see that there's a priesthood and there's a struggling people. So where do these individuals come from? So I want to take some time right now and look at the history of these individuals, because it really sets up, I think, the tone as to why these people are the way they are. So as we see the history of the Pharisees and Sadducees, starting at about 300 BC, high priest by the name of Simon, they call him Simon the Just, has taken power. Around this same time, Alexander the Great has moved into the area and is really beginning to influence their culture with Greek philosophies, the Greek thinking. We call this Hellenistic views. You'll hear me use that word some this morning. Well, Simon does not like this. Simon the Just does not like this Hellenistic culture coming in. So he begins to preach and teach a message of separation between what he calls the real Jews and the ones who are Hellenistic, who are bringing in this Greek culture and accepting this into their lives. And his message begins to spark a fire between groups of people. We see, first off, with the Pharisees. They cling to all of the holy writings. They use all of the New Testament in their studies, the prophets, Proverbs, Psalms, the Torah, the first 5 books, going back and looking at the history of the kings. They're a very studied people, and they use everything. They also put heavy emphasis on the temple worship. It's all about the temple. It's all about the things that happen there. In fact, Jesus makes mention of that, saying, "You will swear by the temple, but not by your own deeds." They are very ritualistic. They stress ceremonialism and all the things that go along with the ceremonies and the rituals, the things that happen at the temple. And they're also big on Jews first and Jews only in Judea. They're not big fans of the Greeks coming in. They're not big fans of the people surrounding them, the Samaritans. And later on, they're really not big fans of Rome. Those are the Pharisees and who they are right now. In fact, their name means to be separate, set aside, different. But then, people, the mass groups did not really like this elitism ideas at this time. So another group forms, and that's the Sadducees. They're what we call the counterculture to this. And they come in and say, well, the Hellenistics are okay. There's a lot to learn from their culture and their ideas that can help us in philosophy and economics. They're okay. They're good people. But they also come in and they minimize the secular and spiritual differences. They say everything that happens in the world are jobs. That's very different than what happens spiritually. Let's separate these things out. Let's not tie them together. And that's definitely not what we see and understand today, right? We should be tying our spiritual and world lives together so we're a consistent people. And these people are also only focused on the Torah, the first 5 books, the books of law. This is where they get all of their authority from. This is where they get all their studies and study from. This also happened to be where most of the priests fell in allegiance with, what are the Sadducees. But by the time you get to Jesus, these groups have even divulged more in a very, very drastic place. You are either going to be on the side of the Pharisees and stand firm with them, or you're going to be way over here with the Sadducees, standing with them and saying, y'all are wrong. You are all fools. There's very few who sit in the middle ground. In fact, we see with the Pharisees, they begin to have what we call the royal checklist, coming in and saying, you cannot even eat with who they call sinners, non-Jews, or those who were traitors to the Jewish culture, the tax collectors, those who would associate themselves with Rome, the traitors. You've betrayed our culture, so you are all sinners. Can't even go and eat with those individuals. Don't go to their homes. Don't eat with them. Oh, but if you have to have some of them or one of them into your home, they have what they call the clean cloth rule, when you get to my house, says a Pharisee, not only do you have to wash your hands and your feet and most of your body, you're going to take off all of your clothes, and you're going to put them in a pile outside, and I'm going to provide you with clean garments, garments that are Jew-approved, garments that fit our needs. This is a little outrageous. We also know that the Pharisees are big on tradition is equal to law. They have what they call the Mishnah, which are what really are rabbinical or rabbis' commentaries on the law. Rabbinical commentaries to the law. And in fact, if you go and look at the Mishnah, it actually states that what is found there is more important than the old law. You need to adhere to what the Mishnah says, not the original scriptures, emphasizing tradition over the law. And we see that if you look in Matthew 23 about tithes. Just look over at verse 23. You should be there already. It says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, of justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." They put unnecessary tithes onto things, coming and saying you have to tax every little thing. Or in their public works, look back at verse 14 of chapter 23. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' homes, and a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you will receive great and greater commendation." They've put so much emphasis on their public works, on their public appearance of things, seeking only man's recognition, not God's. If you want to make a modern equivalent to this, they are very conservative socially, but spiritually, they're pretty far left. They're very liberal in taking and teaching the traditions of men. Their traditions are equal or even greater than the things that God set up for them. That's pretty far left thinking. Well, then you get the Sadducees. They come in with elitism. These are very much, in fact, almost all of the Sadducees were priests. They're the religious elites, the ones who get to directly serve and represent the people to God, having a sense of elitism. And then again, they are only referring in teachings from the Torah, the first 5 books of law, ignoring all of the things that come out of the Psalms and prophets. Jesus makes mentions of the importance of studying the law, the Psalms, and the prophets, all of them together. They were neglecting 2/3 of their spiritual diet. Not good. And I said earlier, they are saying Hellenistics are okay. Well, they're very culturally welcoming in. But if you are a proselyte Jew, one who's been converted from outside of standard Jewish families, yeah, not so much. You can come worship in the temple of the Gentiles, but save your time for the synagogues. Save your time for that Jewish court. You're not allowed into the inner circle of things. You're at a distance still. You're not good enough because you're not an original Jew. And as you see up there, they do not believe in the resurrection or in angels or in spirits, which is very curious because they put all their stake in the Torah, and you find all of those things in the Torah. It's just fascinating to me. Their modern equivalent would be they are very liberal socially as far as the Jewish culture goes. Rome is okay. Let's submit to Rome. The Hellenistics are okay. Socialize with them. But they're very, very, very conservative spiritually. Coming back and saying it's law only. Far right and the far left. Those are only 2 camps at the moment. But Jesus comes in and says, you've missed the picture. You've missed the big picture. Putting thorns in his sides because you've left the truth. You've left the middle ground. What does he say about the Pharisees in Matthew 15? Matthew chapter 15, verses 3 through 9. Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 3. And he answered and said to them, why do you yourselves transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, honor your mother and father, and he who speaks evil of his father or mother is to be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his mother or father, whatever I have that would help you has been given to God. He is not to honor his father or mother. And by this you invalidated the word of God for the sake of your tradition. Again, going back and saying tradition is equal or greater than law. You hypocrites! Rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. That is not encouraging statements from Jesus. He's getting at them at the very root of their problem. You value traditions over law, over truth. Even of the Sadducees, Matthew 22 and verse 29. One verse I'm going to reference here, Matthew 22, 29. As the Sadducees have come asking about resurrection, trying to entrap Jesus, what does he say to them there? But Jesus answered and said to them, you are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures nor the power of God. These individuals claimed to know the law. Yet in their pursuit of conservatism and their pursuit of things, they put blinders on. They fail to see the truth. The things that if you just study the law, you'll see is screaming at you. In trying to attain these earthly perfections, both groups have strayed so very far away from the law and from the point of the law and in the middle where they should have belonged. In a law that reflected God's patience and mercy and love for his people. They would have seen the importance and need of the Messiah to come and save them spiritually, not physically. They were thorns in Jesus' side. They caused so many problems for him. Let's go back to Matthew 23. And we're going to see three problems that arise there. Three thorns that stick in their side and things that we need to identify in our lives to make sure that we are not falling into the same traps. First off, Matthew 23, and go back to verse 3. The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves on the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe. But do not do according to their deeds, for they say things, and they do not do them. They are hypocrites. Hypocrisy. They did not practice what they preached. The word hypocrite comes from the Greek word hypocrites. Hypocrites. I'm not proficient in my Greek. Hypocrites, which means actors on a stage. You are acting. You are not being who you truly are, who you really are. Put it in modern times for us. Angels on Sunday, devils from Monday to Saturday. Put on an outfit. Put on a disguise, a facade for those we're trying to impress. And the rest of the week when I don't have to see you, I'm a very different person. That is what a hypocrite does and says. We already saw what he says in verse 14 of 23 about the hypocrites. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour the widows' homes. For pretense you make long prayers, therefore you will receive greater commendation then. What does he say about them in Matthew chapter 6? In his Sermon on the Mount, what does he say about hypocrites there? Matthew chapter 6 and verse 16. Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face, as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance, so they will be noticed by men when they are fasting. But truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. Those individuals would purposely neglect themselves. Their hair would be a muss. Their clothing would be all over the place. Imagine, if you will, for a second, if Ricky was having a really bad day and wanted your attention, what would he look like? His perfectly groomed hair be all over the place. He wouldn't be wearing his nice suits with his cufflinks. He'd be wearing torn, ripped jeans, T-shirts with holes all in them. He would look very different. He wouldn't be the man that we know. We could tell something was definitely wrong. That is exactly what is happening here in that statement. They're being hypocritical. They weren't supposed to be showing the fast. It was supposed to be a private thing between them and God. And they were abusing it. They're playing the part to garner greater notice and praise. But who are they when they are alone? Who are they when they were alone? Think about, if you will, for a moment, another illustration. A woman gets on an elevator, presses the button and turns to see there's one companion in there with her. And she looks at him for a second. He looks so familiar. And then it clicks. It's Hugh Jackman. This is Hugh Jackman in the elevator to me. I know it has to be. When the elevator gets down to the lobby, she's about to get out and turns and says, "Are you really Hugh Jackman?" The man smiles and says, "Sure. Only when I'm alone, though." He may look the part, but he's not really that man. We can really see who the Pharisees were when they were in private. In public, righteous men, great men, men to walk a line with. But in private, they're grumblers, they are nitpickers, and they're schemers, thorns in Jesus' side. Grumblers, nitpickers, and schemers. Who are we when we're alone, though? Who are we when we are alone? Are we practicing what we preach? Are we living the lives that we proclaim to be having? When we're in the workplace, you joking along when those crude, coarse jokes are being made? At home, watching the TV series and shows that, well, I don't want anyone else at church to know I'm watching these. I got to be quiet about them. I'm afraid that in the future, I don't know if I can feel good about going and seeing the next Marvel or Avengers movie because of the rumors and themes that are coming out about what's going to be in them. I don't know if I can rightly support that. And that's sad to me. I love those movies in that franchise. But I don't know if I can go support that anymore. I don't know what it would look like if the people that in the world that know I'm a Christian can walk out and see, well, that movie must be okay by Ryan. He's a preacher. He's a Christian. Must be okay to go watch then. Who are we when we're alone in our private times? Are we consistent? Or do we put on the face as an actor on the stage? Hypocrisy. Big problem with the Pharisees. Second, in hypocrisy, do we practice what we preach? Feeds into then elitism. That's the second problem we see here in Matthew 23, this form of elitism. Look in verse 4. Matthew 23 and verse 4. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them so much as with a finger. They lay these heavy burdens on and they refuse to help with the load when it gets too hard and too heavy to bear. Elitism occurs when a person takes their own personal standards and then go and apply them to everyone. My belief, my opinion, my truths need to be what you are walking with. And that's just not the case. We need to be all held to the same standard and holding each other to the same standard that's found right here. Elitism has no place within Christians. Here, they place these exhaustive loads on the people. 23:23 again, Matthew 23:23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint, dill, cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law. You're adding things that don't need to be added. You're putting heavier burdens and loads upon your brethren. Higher standards that not everybody can meet. That you're not meeting all the time, you hypocrites. They have corrupted the purpose of the laws, going in and applying things meant specifically for the priests and the priesthood, applying that to everybody. The cleansing of their hands, that's an example of something that was meant for the priests. It was a good sanitation idea, but it was only meant to be applied to the priest as law. Or look over at Luke 18. Luke chapter 18. You want to see a real example of elitism? Jesus gives a very powerful example of their elitism at this time. In Luke 18, in verse 10, parable of the Pharisee and the publican, or the tax collector. Verse 9, he also told the parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. Elitism. Verse 10, 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, and the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself. And this is out loud. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes on all I get. That is elitism. That is elitism in every sense and every word there. I am better than everyone else in this room, especially the guy next to me. So much better than him. Verse 13, but the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you that this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. Elitism at its core. I am better than everyone else in this room, and they know it. I know it. You know it. Thank you for that. That is elitism. Applying our own standards to all. This tax collector wasn't doing any of those such things. Made to feel so much less. Not the case. They corrupted the purpose of the law. And we need to ask ourselves, they needed to ask themselves and say, remember where I come from. Ask ourselves, can we remember where I came from? Who am I doing this for? Am I doing this for God? Because it's what He wants? Because it's the relationship I want with Him? Or are we doing it for man because we want the recognition? Who are we doing this for? We've come together for worship. Who are we doing this for? For me? If I could show off my talented voice, my skills in prayer, my skills in teaching, all the things that we might do behind the scenes, the money we might have to help support one another, the talents of cooking. Am I doing this because it's what's asked and commanded by God? To help encourage and better my brethren? Or am I doing it because I want the pat on the back? Good job. Who am I doing this for? Am I being of the elite? Or the populace, the general crowd? They judging externals of false reflections. That's the third thing we see here. Judging externally. Look at Matthew 23 and verse 27 again. It says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all sorts of uncleanness. Brother, we need to be careful about judging based on the looks and actions that people bring. Careful of judging on appearance. Tattoos do not always mean you're a hooligan. Always mean you're a problem causer and starter. Blue jeans do not always mean that you are apathetic and do not respect what is happening here. That might be the best you have. That might be what you are bringing to honor God. And that's okay. Being quiet in class does not mean that I'm not paying attention. Again, that I'm apathetic or care. It may mean I'm just taking everything in. Studying because I don't know. I might not have an opinion. I'm learning just as much as anyone else. Reminds me of the story of the young preacher who goes to a member's house. They know he is coming, or he thinks they know. He knocks on the door for 10, 15 minutes and no one is answering. So he takes out his card and on the back writes Revelation 3 and verse 20. Behold, I came knocking and no one answered. Well, Sunday rolls around and he finds a card sitting on his desk with Genesis 3:10 written on it. It said, behold, I was in the garden, and I was naked and was afraid. We cannot judge based on appearances and actions. Sometimes we have no idea what is happening in the background. Or even the reverse of things. Just because we look like Christians on Sunday and Wednesday does not mean that we are one, that we are behaving appropriately The heart matters just as much as hands and actions do. That our actions should flow from us just as much as our sincere heart lives in us. When we go out from here, do the people at work, at our extracurricular activities, do they know that you are a Christian? Or are you putting on a farce, putting on a mask, playing the hypocrite? It reminds me of the Queen Mary. If you're not familiar with this ship, she is currently docked at Long Beach, California. She has a proud military history, sailing for 40 plus years, serving in at least one, maybe two world wars. And they have retired her. They put her at Long Beach, and she is now a museum and a hotel. You can go stay and sleep in this beautiful vessel. But when they were converting the ship over, they took the smokestacks off to replace them, to restore them. And when they began to take the paint off, you know what happened? The smokestacks literally crumbled and fell apart because nothing remained of the 3/4 inch thick steel plating. Nothing was left because it all rusted away. It was being held up literally by the paint. All that remained on the docks was a pile of rust and paint flakes. Because when we are stripped down to the core, when we are stripped down to our core, do we still carry our spiritual structural integrity? Or when we're stripped down to the core, are we just a pile of useless rust and paint flakes? Are we putting on a show? Are others judging us, our externalities appropriately, and us the same? Hypocrisy. Do we practice what we preach? Elitism. Who do we do this for? And when we judge externally, what does our reflection show? If others look at us, what do we show? These two factions, the Pharisees and Sadducees, were such a thorn in Jesus' side. They had corrupted his law, changed it in ways to make themselves look good and righteous, and instead put guilt and undue pressure upon the people. They used these traditions, which in and of themselves were not always bad, but they used them, turned them into law, and then used those same traditions to accuse Jesus and his disciples over and over again of sin. And every time Jesus comes back and says, "You hypocrites, go back and look at what you're doing. Go back to the Word." What does he say of these people? Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23. We wrap up. This is what he says about these people who are hypocrites, who carry elitism in their life, and who are judging everybody externally based on what they do and can provide. Matthew 7, verse 21. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on this day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name and perform many miracles?' All good things, all things that have been given by God. And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" Let us make sure that we are not walking down the paths of the Pharisees and the Sadducees in our lives, but instead we are following down the path that has been laid out by God.